Welcome to our penultimate seminar of our seminar series that Jessica Nesova and David Madden are co-convening for this term, which is about geopolitics. And we've gone through a number of themes that are related to geopolitical changes and challenges in the region of Southeast Europe. Last week there was a talk of cybersecurity, which may be related or is related to today's talk as well. We've spoken about Kosovo, Serbia, and other challenges in the region. And today we are speaking about Russia. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Othon Anastasakis, Director of Southeast European Studies here at CSOX. And to my left is Roy Allison, who's well known to all of you because he's one of the most prominent scholars on Russia. And he's a professor of Eurasian Studies here in Oxford. And also Andreja, your surname? Bogdanovski, who is a PhD student at the University of Buckingham. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, his supervisor was giving a talk here on energy in the Eastern Mediterranean. So you've got the CVs here in case you want to have a look at them. But I would like, as a start, to maybe put some issues on the table, on the Russian roulette, as it were, and maybe start in an orthodox way by looking at several cliches about Russia in the Balkans. Because there's been so much written on Russia in Southeast Europe, and most of it actually is identical to each other, and there are some assumptions that are really, really strongly held, and especially in this country as well. So I thought that I would choose 7 cliches and see how overstated they are in a way, but then the speakers here would be able to elaborate a little bit more on their own kind of themes and follow up on this discussion. So starting with the first cliche is that the Russian security threat is very big in the region of Southeast Europe. Indeed, the degree of intrusion and disruption of the Russian anti-Western security threat is massive, and it puts in danger the European Union project as well as the region, because it's also a very vulnerable region. And indeed, that to a certain degree may be true, in the sense that Russia has been visible in terms of creating diplomatic incidents with many countries in the region, Bulgaria and Serbia, in Montenegro, in Greece. It was also involved in an alleged coup in Montenegro in 2016. It was also involved in the spreading of fake news in North Macedonia during the time that the name dispute was discussed. It did create divisions within the Greek government as well. And also it creates military partnerships with Serbia or Republika Srpska. And in that respect, it is considered to be a major military and security challenge in the region. But what about the effectiveness of all this? I mean, Montenegro is part of NATO. Croatia is part of NATO as well. North Macedonia, the problem with the name dispute was solved despite the Russian efforts to the opposite, and at the same time is a member state of NATO. The transatlantic orientation of the countries in the Balkans, with the exception of Serbia and Republika Srpska, is something which is not contested. And even the case of Kosovo, where the role of Russia is very, very strong, you know, the EU has its own problems with 5 member states not having recognized Kosovo anyway. So the problem doesn't start from Russia. And in many ways, in terms of this security issue, Russia does better with frozen conflicts, but it doesn't generate new conflicts in Southeast Europe. The second cliche that I would like to point here is about Russia's soft power. That Russia has a soft power in the Balkans. It's been mentioned a lot. It is able, according to the definition of the term, to attract and co-opt and influence the preferences of the local actors by using basically its soft power and ideological, cultural, or institutional means. And it's been prominent in terms of its role in religion. Andreja will be talking about this. In terms of the language that is spoken in the region, or media presence, which is becoming more and more intense. But soft power can be contested in two ways. The first one is that when we talk about soft power, we don't exactly see soft power in the way that Joseph Nye perceived it in the first place, which was in the context of democracy promotion and the liberal world and the cosmopolitan kind of ideal, and the soft power that these big Western countries had. Today is something different, and there are even authors that are discussing about China's soft power. And the second thing is how soft is Russia's power in the region. I mean, yes, the instruments are there, but the way that Russia is using them in the geopolitical kind of sense, it doesn't allow too much space, basically, to create that kind of attraction to actors to do what Russia would like them to do. And the use of media is basically about conspiracies and fake news, so not so much about soft power. The soft power of Russia is very, very selective. It is actually directed towards certain clients in the region, and at the same time, it's also very divisive. And also look at the power, the soft power of Russia in terms of the migratory patterns. All actually people in the Western Balkans, they would like to go to the West, either to study or to work. I haven't seen many people wanting to go to the universities in Moscow or to be attracted by society and life in Russia. The third cliché that I would like to point out, and that's about Russia being part of those external actors in the Balkans. And how this whole kind of thing is perceived is that Putin is one of those important external actors, together with others like Turkey or China, that go against the West. They make the most of enlargement fatigue, of the weaker conditionality from the part of the EU, or from the internal crises that are happening into the European Union. And that, again, is to a certain degree true, but at the same time, Russia's influence is often compounded with blatant geopolitics and threats and negativity and conspiracy, which is not exactly the same case with the other countries. The Turkish influence, for instance, is much more cultural. Indeed, in many parts of the Balkans, Erdogan, although an authoritarian leader that he is also admired by many people there. And similarly with the role of China. China makes the region feel much better about itself because it talks about geoeconomic power and about investment. And that, that contradicts actually on the image and Russia that Russia manages to have in the region of Southeast Europe. And then also, even if compared with the Gulf states as well, they have been very prominent in terms of many investments. So by emphasizing these external actors as a group, one doesn't see that, first of all, these external actors may have competing interests in themselves in the region of Southeast Europe, and at the same time, they have a very different approach and an impact and effectiveness. For Russia, the region is almost blatantly about geopolitics and balance of power with the West, which is not the case with the other actors so much. My fourth cliché is about Russian influence in a vulnerable Balkan state. If you can go to the next one, which is about the countries that haven't managed to become member of the European Union yet, and Russia can infiltrate there as it wishes and makes a mess or being a disruptor. But that's not exactly the case, because it's not just one-way direction. And it's not a one-way direction from this monocentric great power Russia to the polycentric Balkans. In reality, the governments in the Balkans as well are also playing their own game with Russia as a leverage vis-a-vis their own relationship with the West. And where Russia is geopolitical, the Western Balkan states can also be very pragmatic, practical, and transactional in their relationship with Russia. And that's what I have called in one of my chapters of this, is about a pragmatic neo-Titoism. I mean, many of these countries have actually been, have the legacy and the way of practice that Tito had, that he was playing with all, with all the countries and following that kind of an independent path. Then we'll go to And even sometimes the fact that they say that Russia kind of feeds fake news to the vulnerable and uneducated Balkan people. Think about it. I mean, it's the same thing as Western Europe. Many other countries have also vulnerable people that are believing in fake news and sometimes vote for exit from the European Union. The fifth cliché that I would like to contest is the Russian-Serbian friendship. If you can go to the next one. And this is a lot said about the Russian-Serbian Slavic and Orthodox brotherhood and friendship, and how this is taken for granted that this is a sustainable kind of relationship. Having said that, and while there is indeed a closeness that has been very prominent during the last 2 decades since the 1990s, 3 decades actually, the reality is that the history of relations between Serbia and Russia hasn't been exactly very smooth, and the Slavic dimension and the Orthodox dimension didn't play any part whatsoever during the Tito years. You probably all remember that in 1948 there was a massive split, and during the Stalin years there was a complete divergence between Yugoslavia and Russia, but then there were some efforts to kind of bring them back together, which always were hopeful and not so successful. And in any ways, Yugoslavia was always the object of conspiracy from Moscow as well. So taking for granted that there is a Serbian-Russian relationship and that it's going to be sustainable and work is not exactly always very accurate, because it's based on 2 things. One is Kosovo, and the other one is the EU enlargement that is not progressing with Serbia. And the case of Kosovo in particular is very interesting, because if the US appears, as it appears to be actually, quite dynamic in terms of solving the Serbia-Kosovo issue, that is going to create a problem with Russia and what kind of role Russia wants to project in the region. In Bosnia, it's maybe even more difficult, given the fact that Russia is close to Republika Srpska, and it also wants Bosnia to sustain its own kind of unity, because that prohibits Bosnia from becoming a member of NATO. But at the same time, when you've got Dodik, who really and strongly now advocates that he wants to go for independence for Republika Srpska, that actually creates a sort of a problem for Russia's approach to the region. The 6th is the energy issue and the energy dependency, and I know that Roy is going to talk about this, so very, very briefly, with the next slide, please. That is something which is not sustainable either. We have seen that Russia, although there's a lot of talk about the dependency of the region on Russia, on energy, that in terms of a multilateral and a long-term strategy, and the South Stream that was cancelled in one night, and then the Turkish stream that took its place, shows that, again, there is no plan, but there are bilateral transactions and agreements between Russia and the countries in the region. And my final point, and I will stop at that, which is about the illiberal model. And it has been said that democratic backsliding is also served well by Putin's illiberal influence and support for populist and far-right alternatives. That may be partly true, although I don't believe in this very much, because democratic backsliding is more, in my opinion, part of the EU's negligence of the region and the reduced political conditionality, and lately populism. And in many ways, maybe Trump and the way that he governs is more of a model for these countries in the region than Putin or Orban are. Sure, there are connections with far-right parties and extreme radical nationalists and the underworld, but these are also very marginal within the Western Balkan context. So with those 7 cliches, and the kind of, because we have heard these statements to be overstated in a way, I would like to close, and I will and then ask our speakers to deepen a little bit more on the issues. And would you like to start, Roy?
Thank you, Othon. I think that provides an excellent way into what I have to say, which is going to focus on strategic intentions, objectives, aspirations indeed. And I think that this will show how some of the cliches that Othon has described have come about, because if we take some of the stated aspirations and some reasonably inferred hopes, you can see that it's easy to inflate concerns on that basis, and that's sustained very defensive narratives often about Russia's potential influence. I'll just begin with a comment on Russia's wider strategic perspective on Southeast Europe, and then I'll focus more specifically on approaches to the Balkans, especially the Western Balkans. For Russia, there has been something of a change in strategic thinking towards Romania and Bulgaria in particular. These acquire something of what we could say a secondary axis of confrontation with NATO because of their position as Black Sea states, in particular since 2014. Now, Russia has tried to assert influence within the Black Sea, you might say rightfully for a long period of time. It has had negligible presence within the East Mediterranean for most of the post-Cold War period, but that has changed. So with the occupation of Crimea and the creation of a whole variety of new bases, indeed a resuscitation of Cold War era bases, an extension and modernisation, new military technology, and the effort to try and sustain a permanent naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean in support of Syrian operations, the Black Sea becomes now an interconnecting zone between these two strategic areas of concern. And that means that there are more points of potential friction with NATO and NATO states, particular on the Black Sea coast. This is managed so far, but it is something of a shift. Of course, what's happened in Ukraine has also had an effect on some of Russia's older sort of historical strategic points of emphasis. Take the 14th Army, which is situated in Moldovan Transnistria. In the Cold War period, this had a role projecting influence and to westward, connecting up with Warsaw Pact states. Now, I'd say, in fact, it's rather exposed. It's more an adjunct of Russia's adversarial relationship with Ukraine, not really Western focused in the same way. It's somewhat out of a limb, left hanging. If we turn to the Western Balkans more specifically, the first obvious point is they are surrounded by NATO territory, and as such, it cannot be a region where Moscow can expect to project much influence in a traditional military strategic sense. And I would say here, agreeing with Othon, it's questionable whether the region is one where the current Russian leadership seriously imagines itself to have some kind of natural, legitimate geopolitical influence based on historical bonds, at least any more than it does in other parts of Eastern Europe, even if it is trying to assert influence through a spectrum of instruments. Nonetheless, I think that's it is viewed in a very different way to Russia's zones of entitlement, if you like, in the CIS region. There's a myth, really, I think, of these civilizational or historical bonds with Serbia creating a special relationship beyond the cultural field. I mean, we'll hear more about the religious ties, but the reference Othon made to Yugoslavia under Tito is very relevant here. I mean, it was very far from a Soviet ally in the sense of the Warsaw Pact states being used on alignment to maintain distance, indeed, from the Soviet Union. And although Kosovo and Macedonian Albanians seem quite anti-Russian in general mood, with the Orthodox Serbs at the other end, Russia also has little traction among Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats, although perhaps some with Orthodox Macedonians. So it's a very mixed picture, really, and it's not it doesn't offer a natural region of support and sympathy across the territories. Now, turning to actual strategic objectives, I'll consider a number of them, and I would refer you to the excellent book by Dimitar Bichev, who spoke in this room, in fact, quite recently. And I agree with a number of the claims he makes in that volume on Russia and the Balkans. First, I think the Western Balkans are approached as part of broader Russian efforts to establish itself as what we could call a first-rate player in European security affairs. So they're, as it were, an extension of that wider, more important role, trying to establish itself as on a par with other major Western European states, France and Germany and so forth. Having some access in the Balkans helps Russia insert itself into the debates about the European security and defence policy, NATO-EU enlargement, and those, of course, are issues of real concern to Moscow. And turning it around, conversely, Russia's keenly interested in how divisions between West European states on how far to engage with Russia can feed into ESD and EU policy with effects in the Balkans. And most obviously, and recently, you see President Macron's recent veto of the EU accession talks for North Macedonia and Albania, which could say has rather shaken the basis of European Union Western Balkans relations. And at the same time, of course, Macron is calling for greater involvement of Russia in European affairs, and it is for the interaction between these processes that Russia looks on with considerable interest. Secondly, the Balkans is viewed by Russia as a region on the periphery of Europe, which, compared to other parts of Europe, or the more core Europe, is more exposed to various ways to gain local supporters and complicate the enlargement prospects I referred to. So it's another matter of effectiveness is another issue, which we will discuss, and I think Othon has raised that importantly right at the start. Obviously, the gravitational pull of former Yugoslav republics and Albania remains westward, so Russia can't seriously, in a sense, it can't compete on the economic or trade grounds, and therefore it chooses to focus on other domestic issues, we could call them vulnerabilities, to see if these might weaken EU and NATO engagement in the region. And that comes down to instrumentalising various disputes in the area, playing upon non-transparent processes, corruption, and a broader distrust of citizens in public institutions, which of course is not exclusive to this region, we certainly find it in this region. To take a specific case, if Bosnia is kept unstable, more unstable, then Russia seems to believe it would slow down its Euro-Atlantic integration. And there is some evidence in this other one case to study how Russia supported various groups in 2018, hoping to obstruct North Macedonia's reconciliation process with Greece. And of course, the failure of that cleared the path for NATO accession. So, using local disputes. Third, Russia displays some of what we could call quid pro quo thinking in asserting its local influence in Balkan states. What I mean by this is that it's showing Western states who it claims are interfering in its own zone of privileged interests, that's Ukraine, Georgia, CIS area. In fact, in areas which the European Union continues to consider its eastern neighbourhood, showing these countries that Russia is entitled to do the same in their backyard. Fourth, and I think this is a perception that is still keenly felt by President Putin himself, the grievance over Russian failure, even humiliation, in 1999 over Kosovo. Now, on one level, this is a narrative that's become very entrenched in Russian politics and among Russian politicians. But if you go back to that time, President Yeltsin himself offered very limited support for Serbia and opposed calls within the Russian State Duma for supplying arms, for supplying militias and the like. Putin was a serious political actor at the time. He was director of the FSB, and he positioned himself, if you look at his language, as a fervent critic of NATO action, calling it a threat not just to Europe but to the whole world. And this language spilled over into the period when he became acting president. And so I think that at least what we could say is that for Putin, reinserting Russia into the Balkans has this kind of psychological backdrop. It's still there in his mind. It's not just a political narrative, although it serves that purpose also within Russia. Fifth, to the extent that Russia is effectively involved in the region and can, in a way, parlay this influence on issues such as talks between Serbia and Kosovo or domestic affairs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is status enhancing. This is about maintaining Russia's status internationally. It's about confirming that Russia, as a United Nations Security Council permanent member, has to be accepted as a top-ranked power without whom no major conflicts of the day can be resolved. And that kind of language you see quite frequently coming out from the Russian Foreign Ministry. There's been some speculation, incidentally, that if Kosovo and Serbia could strike some kind of historic compromise deal, which produces some form of Serbian recognition of Kosovo, then Russia's agreement, its assent as a Security Council member, would come at the price of some quid pro quo over Crimea. Personally, I think that's rather an unlikely trade-off for various reasons, but it's been floating around for some time. Now, given these objectives, as I've outlined them, if you can accept some of this, Russia's not near as dependent on military relationships in the Balkans as it has to be in other world regions where it doesn't have networks of political, social, religious, economic, energy, intelligence ties. This is rather a thick relationship that Russia has on various levels. And so when we talk about geopolitical and military relations, really it's, I think, misdirected in many senses. The military links with Serbia, for example, are not strong particularly. There has been some concern in the West about the Russian-Serbian humanitarian centre, so-called humanitarian centre in Niš in central Serbia. This could act as some kind of cover for intelligence gathering and so forth. But Russia has failed to get recognition of the centre diplomatic status, despite persistent Russian efforts. We see some Western concern about Serbian troops taking part in military training exercises with Russia and Belarus. Most recently and quite visibly, and this was reported locally a lot, the Slavic Brotherhood exercises in July 2018. The title, obviously, was calculated to provoke some reaction. And Serbia became observer already to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Russian-led body, back in 2013. In fact, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu visited Serbia just 2 weeks ago, and at that time he talked up the pace of development of Serbian-Russian military cooperation. But if you look at it in the round, in fact, Serbian forces take part in a greater number of exercises with NATO than with these eastern structures. And this is, of course, while Serbia does have an official policy of neutrality. So military relations aren't really at the core of this. How about energy? Russia did have some grand ambitions for the South Stream gas pipeline, but that pipeline project collapsed more or less after the crisis over Ukraine broke out. And now Turk Stream is being presented as an alternative, at least an alternative to Russia's supply of gas through Ukraine. The terminus it has on the Turkish-Greek border could be possibly connected to a possible new Tesla pipeline in the Balkans. And Russia has expressed hopes that Bulgaria and Serbia could play a major role in transmitting natural gas from Turk Stream to Europe. This is the second string of Turk Stream. Turk Stream 2, where the plan is to deliver gas to the Balkans and further to South and Central Europe. However, its capacity is not large, about 15.75 BCM, and it's only a quarter of the defunct South Stream pipeline. And really, this small capacity will limit Gazprom's ability to control markets in southeastern Europe, impedes its ability to compete with the southern gas corridor from Azerbaijan, coming from the Shah Deniz field and those Caspian fields. And in addition to which, the European Union Gas Directive may constrain Gazprom from using the full capacity of the onshore extension of Turk Stream 2. So the talk of the Balkans becoming overly dependent on Russian energy doesn't seem to me to really hold up. And here I agree with Othon. What instruments does this leave Russia left? Some of these are aspirational, but let me run through a few. First, inserting itself into local politics in the Balkans. For example, encouraging nationalist activities in states such as Montenegro, North Macedonia, which are more pro-EU and pro-NATO. Secondly, developing relationships and ties with local political figures, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sometimes financial gains by local politicians and corruption oils these relationships. But governments also have sought benefits from non-transparent flows of money, assisted by Russian businessmen close to the Kremlin. And you might expect Russia to think it would benefit, and indeed on other local businessmen to benefit from Serbia signing the free trade agreement with the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union last October. I'm a bit doubtful about this because you have to put this into the wider perspective of Serbian trade. And Serbia's total trade with the 5 Eurasian Economic Union states in 2018 amounted to $3.4 billion compared to $28.6 billion equivalent for trade with the European Union. In fact, that free trade agreement with the EU didn't change anything very much with Eastern trade because Serbia already had bilateral free trade agreements with the big players within the EU. So there are certain financial flows and possibilities. Third instrument, disinformation campaigns. Now this has got particular attention. Perhaps media like to focus on what other media are doing. The attention has been about how these have tried to rouse opposition against NATO accession in particular, and involve taking advantage of various local grievances against Western states, cultivating conservative Orthodox communities, which we'll hear about more, finding common ground with far-right nationalist groups, and alongside this go certain broader narratives about Western states allegedly using so-called colour revolutions to undermine local governments. And the West is presented as the cause of the region's democratic deficiencies, its economic troubles, continued ethnic divisions. In 2017, for example, the Russian Foreign Ministry repeated the false assertion that Albania, with the support of the European Union, NATO and Kosovo, was seeking territorial claims against its neighbours, that is Greece, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia. A kind of Greater Albania propaganda. And you could assume the aim of this was to increase tensions between the country's majority Macedonian population and minority Albanian population, as well as promote regional discord. But if so, it hasn't done it very effectively. So we're back to the actual the result of this kind of activities. Well, the reality is it's a region where you have countries, majority countries, where integration with the European Union and NATO doesn't seem to be diminishing, and these kind of activities are not halting it. Russia may expect in these circumstances that various channels of cultural or economic or political leverage will offer some kind of economic and political influence in those states after accession. That's a fairly limited objective, it seems to me, and it's not one that you might expect not expect of a country, even if it was one which was on more favourable terms with the West. This is about a fairly normal geopolitical assertion. My conclusion here really is that the region of the Western Balkans in particular, maybe a little less so if you widen it out to Southeast Europe, is not a region of primary strategic interest for Russia. But it is a zone in which it does have some capacities to project influence in various ways at rather little cost. And, if nothing else, keep Western states somewhat off balance. And I would summarise it by saying that Moscow exercises a policy or has aspirations of limited strategic denial. And that denial effort has been focused against Western institutions and the speed of integration of local states into those institutions. And we may discuss separately whether Russia's concerns about those institutions are completely valid or exaggerated, particularly in the case of the European Union, but that seems to be the case. But the means used, some of the means anyway, risk inflaming wider tensions on the ground, which of course is a serious Western worry. And Russia may hope that this could create grey areas politically and diplomatically, and undercut to some extent the transatlantic orientation of some of these states, sustain Serbia's perception of its neutrality, which is important in itself, and at the same time maybe reduce the ability of Western states to focus on Russia's core regions of concern, which nowadays, of course, have to include Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Roy. Andreja, over to you.
Brilliant.
We'll use the others.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you tonight. Thanks to the CSOX family for inviting me. So basically, I will try to focus my sort of 15-20 minutes around the topic of the relations between the Orthodox Church and especially focusing on the Russian Orthodox Church and its relationship with states in Southeast Europe and in the Western Balkans. I would focus primarily on 3 states. I would speak briefly about Greece, and then I picked North Macedonia and Montenegro being the 2 that are very much of interest at the moment. As Othon mentioned, I'm doing my PhD in autocephaly movements in Eastern Europe, so I'm very much focused on the reasons behind and sort of conditions under which political elites in Eastern Europe are joining forces to pursue this policy of church independence. I got back last year. I spent most of the time doing field work, so sort of impressions from that point as well. I would definitely start, my departure point would be to talk briefly about the Ukrainian case, because that would give us the idea about the Russian Orthodox Church involvement in Southeast Europe. This is of definitely big importance for the region, because it is in 2018 and 2019 that the Ukrainians got their sort of independent church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This was after big efforts by President Poroshenko to have this delivered. And this has definitely created big shockwaves across the world of Orthodoxy, across Southeast Europe especially, but also in Eastern Europe. I mean, this has definitely changed the trajectory of how different camps in the Orthodox world position themselves. So because it was so controversial, this issue of granting Ukrainian autocephaly, and it was so political and of geopolitical importance. Now we have 2 years later, we have basically 2 or 3 blocks among the Orthodox churches. So on one side, we have those sort of supporting the role of the ecumenical patriarchate sitting in Istanbul, the patriarch sitting in Istanbul, who is sort of the first among the equals in the Orthodox world. And here in this basket, in this sort of frame, we would put primarily churches, so Church of Greece, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, surprisingly, that have really supported the ecumenical patriarch in his policy to grant autocephaly of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And then on the other side, we have a number of churches that are sort of orbiting and really supporting the Russian Orthodox Church view on this. And that is Serbian Orthodox Church, among the most vocal supporters, Polish Orthodox Church, Church of Czech lands and Slovakia. Then we have the Antioch Church. Then we have Patriarchate of Jerusalem. And then on the third sort of basket, we have sort of churches that are somewhere in between. They haven't really made up their mind yet about this. Here I would put the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, Romanian Orthodox Church, Albanian Orthodox Church to some extent, and even maybe Church of Cyprus. But they still they still have a very limited maneuver to make up their minds, because this is something that's going to stay. It's not something that's going to be healed overnight, unfortunately. So how this affected Southeast Europe, and especially the Western Balkans? Well, this has definitely, after the proclamation of autocephaly in the case of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, this has definitely reinvigorated the claims for independent churches in 2 countries, especially the case with Montenegro and North Macedonia. These are 2 very different cases, but I will speak about them a bit later. But I would like to focus a bit more on the sort of point that Othon made at the beginning about the 7 clichés. And sort of among analysts, we often read how the Russian Orthodox Church is sort of seen as a tool of Moscow's influence all around sort of Eastern Europe, Southeast Europe, Asia, and so on. But also, I would claim here that what we are not seeing is that this autocephaly in the case of Ukraine has dramatically impacted the position of the Russian Orthodox Church worldwide. It has definitely weakened its position, and I think that we should sort of see and try to see and analyze things through this position, because the Russian Orthodox Church has been trying extremely hard in the last 5 years to sabotage, prolong, postpone, make impossible the Ukrainian autocephaly. It has definitely impacted its possibility to influence Ukraine first and foremost, but also elsewhere. Then we have this sort of, once this happened, then we have a plethora of other actions that sort of continue to show us how the Russian Orthodox Church has its position weakened. And this starts with the number of recognitions that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine has. I mean, in just 1 year, it received recognition in October last year from the Church of Greece. Then a few weeks later, it received recognition from the Patriarchate of Alexandria, which is influential church among the Orthodox churches, and there is a discussion about others as well. And probably sort of in this string of events, the last one would be just last week. Basically, it was supposed to be a big gathering of Orthodox churches in Amman, in Jordan, that was supposed to sort of send a message to the ecumenical patriarch that he's really did wrong in Ukraine. He transgender his sort of rights, and his role has been really problematic. And this was supposed to sort of have all of the churches, not all, but sort of a lot of the churches there present in the meeting. So out of 15, only 4 showed up. And that's Serbian Orthodox Church, which sent its patriarch. Romanian Orthodox Church was a bit of a wild card, surprise. Then it was the Polish Orthodox Church and Church of Czech lands and Slovakia, and the Russian Orthodox Church. So basically, those were those that showed up. They did have a communique, sort of a final statement condemning and trying to resolve the Ukrainian church issue, but it was seen by the sort of wider Orthodoxy as a failed attempt, first and foremost, of the Russian Orthodox Church diplomacy. So how did the Russian Orthodox Church respond to this? It severed completely relations with the ecumenical patriarchate, so it cut communion last year. This is sort of similar to breaking diplomatic ties among states. But also it's interesting how it positions itself when it comes to the recognizers, those that recognized Ukrainian autocephaly. I mean, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, and also a very important Church of Greece. Now, here in this case, it chose a different strategy. It chose to sort of have targeted cessation of communion. So it didn't go in the sense of breaking communion completely, but it sort of said, okay, we would break communion with those hierarchs of Church of Greece that would be in favor of Ukrainian autocephaly. And this is something that I believe is a strategy to sort of show, to create a discord, a division within the churches themselves, so that other churches would then question this over and over in the sense of prolonging their decision whether to recognize the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or not. And also another interesting fact that they did is that they instructed Russian travel agencies to stop pilgrims visiting pilgrimage sites across Greece. This is something that the ecumenical patriarch, for example, he called this a murky affair that is supposed to inflict economical pain to and also create a discord with the Church of Greece. Now, if you look into the Western Balkans, I mean, this is something that is very trending in the last year or so, because it's not news at all, and I think Roy mentioned here about this alliance between the Serbian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, but we should sort of question more about what's new about this. And when we think about why the Serbian Orthodox Church is so vocal to sort of support the non-recognition of the Ukrainian autocephaly and to support the Russian Orthodox Church, in this case, it's because it has its own headaches in the Balkans. I mean, don't forget that it claims canonical jurisdiction over the territories of North Macedonia and Montenegro. And in these two countries, we have very up and running autocephaly, pro-independence movements. So this is where this support, I think, primarily comes from. I mean, I'll just read. So the Patriarch of Serbia, Irene, like just last month, he was quoted saying, "The Lord gave the Holy Russian people two great personalities that are important not only for Russia, but for the whole Orthodox world, and even more broadly, Russian Patriarch Kirill and Russian President Putin. This is a gift from God, and not only to them, but to us as well. We're very grateful to the Russian Patriarch and the President of Russia for everything that they do for our people and our church." This is a statement by Patriarch Irene. So And don't forget, Patriarch Kirill said that Putin is a miracle of God when he described it. So we have this very sort of interesting support and statements coming across. Now, with Montenegro, this is extremely interesting case because ever since early 2018, following the successful campaign done by the Ukrainian president then Poroshenko, President Djukanovic decided that he should really play by his rule book, and he sort of copies Poroshenko's strategy to create, sort of tries to create and to lobby for an independent Montenegrin Orthodox Church. And in December 2019, in Montenegro, there is this adoption of this very controversial law on freedom of religion, which really brought hundreds of thousands of Montenegrins on the streets across Montenegro. There is one very problematic paragraph in this law, which says that all church property, all religious property built prior to 1918, this is the year when Montenegro joined Serbia, for which the religious organization in question doesn't have proof of ownership, will be transferred to the state. So this is something that the Serbian Orthodox Church believes that it definitely violates the freedom of religion, because it feels that this is something that the Montenegrin authorities will take against them in the long run, and created sort of all these massive protests across Montenegro, which are happening even today, twice a week. And then on North Macedonia, we have also interesting movement here, but I would claim that this is something that's not necessarily related with the Ukrainian case, but this is something that it has a different trajectory, basically. After the signing of the Good Friendship Treaty with Bulgaria and the Prespa Accords, there is an opening now for resolution of the Macedonian Orthodox Church question, and the Ecumenical Patriarchate and Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew himself, for the first time, this is a lingering problem from the 1960s, decided to put the Macedonian church question appeal into motion. And not necessarily, that doesn't mean that he would grant autocephaly, but he for the first time said that, okay, this is something that I will definitely look through, because prior to this he was all the time sending, every time a Macedonian delegation would come and appeal, he was saying, go to Belgrade, this is where you need to sort out things, not with me. Now, what's in it from the Russian Orthodox Church point of view? Well, this is very interesting because Othon mentioned about this 7 myths, and I would claim that actually the Russian Orthodox Church basically is using the situation in the Western Balkans to advance its own narratives and agenda around the Ukrainian ecclesiastical question and about the Ukrainian conflict, and it's doing that to improve its deteriorated international standing. I mean, we are seeing, of course, that it's trying also to use these soft power mechanisms, but I think that this is the key here that many analysts are not sort of trying to see, because we see this coordinated fashion among statements coming from Russian Orthodox Church quite frequently, actually, together with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, that are very much aligned with statements coming from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and some members of the Duma, basically saying that whatever is happening in the Western Balkans, we've seen this scenario in Ukraine, we are warning you about that, we warned you about that, and we know how it will end. And basically they're saying that what the Montenegrin president is doing now in Montenegro, and this is something that the outgoing ambassador, I think, in Serbia said, that he would have the same destiny as Poroshenko. So if you remember, Poroshenko didn't win actually the presidential elections in 2019, even though he really thought that the autocephaly would bring this win for him. Montenegro finds this really disturbing, actually, the authorities there. They've come out several times saying that this is interfering in our domestic affairs. They are saying that we are a NATO member state. We are sort of trying to push away what Moscow is trying to do, especially considering 2016 and the involvement there with the NATO accession. It even hosts in January I think it's called anti-hybrid team coming from NATO to sort of try to, because of all the protests happening in Montenegro at the moment, try to, and all the Russian interests and interest from Serbia, and especially the media tries to sort of rebuff. How is it doing it? What the Russian Orthodox Church is doing? I'm saying that there are three pillars actually. Here, the first pillar is basically a narrative that the Russian Orthodox Church is saying that the political elites in Montenegro, especially, and then in North Macedonia, are basically doing this, as we've seen in the case of Ukraine. This is something that they are interfering into church affairs. They're not supposed to. They are secular countries according to their constitutions. I mean, it's very interesting coming from the Russian Orthodox Church and its relations with the Russian Federation. But then, as I mentioned, there is this sort of claim that politicians should stay out of it. Then the second sort of narrative and pillar is against ecumenical patriarchate, and the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew in particular, because of this thing that he did in the case of Ukraine, where they're saying that exactly what he's done in Ukraine, he would do the same in North Macedonia. And he's sort of getting ready to do that. Not necessarily in the case of Montenegro, because it's very interesting. In Montenegrin case, both the ecumenical patriarchate and the Russian Orthodox Church have the same view, that the president of the country is trying to create his own church, and they are not supporting it. And then lastly, it's that the United States and the State Department are against all of this, that they were, and Washington was behind the Ukrainian autocephaly, and this Washington that is sort of helping other Orthodox churches to recognize Ukrainian autocephaly, and it's because of Washington that Skopje and Podgorica are pursuing the autocephaly course. So these are the three narratives that the Russian Orthodox Church is using to sort of push forward this agenda. And I have just two photos to show. This photo is taken in Athens. It's taken on the 11th of October last year, where representatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate are giving out booklets, promotional materials, you name it, to hierarchs of the Greek Orthodox, or Church of Greece actually, before they were to make the decision about recognition for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church autocephaly. This is taken just the day before. And this one, it's also from last weekend actually, very recent. And this is sort of the concrete support that we are seeing. On the right, we're seeing the Metropolitan Onufri. He is the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, who came to give his support to those that are protesting in Montenegro because of this controversial law that I mentioned. And left of him is the sort of head of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro, Metropolitan Amfilohije, who basically we're seeing how transnationally churches, you can say that they can interfere domestic politics or also support, depending on the views you have. So that's sort of more or less what I have to say.
Thank you very much, and very exciting. I mean, the geopolitics of religion is actually very exciting. We don't get to hear it, very, very often.